It's been about a year since the release of Sonic Frontiers, and the game has changed quite a lot in that time. In my original video on the game, I was a little skeptical about the new direction for the series. Despite having solid characterization and fun character moments, I found the plot as a whole to be rushed and borderline unfinished in a lot of areas. The open zone, while vast and providing a fluid gameplay loop, felt visually uninspired and wasn't very engaging. The combat, while flashy, was heavily skewed in the player's favor, which made most encounters pretty samey and boring overall, even on the highest difficulty. Cyberspace, while a neat idea on paper, boiled down to worse versions of pre-existing stages, and as a result didn't hold my attention for very long outside of a few original levels near the end of the game. Despite all of this, I'm happy to say that after some recent updates and changes, my outlook on the game has changed for the better. Some of these changes are just smaller quality of life additions, but some bring new modes, abilities, and even a free story expansion that acts as an alternate ending. These updates have done a lot to improve my thoughts on the game and make me more confident in the direction of the series going forward. So I thought it would be fun to take a look at what's changed now that all the content is out. So let's start at the beginning and talk about what was added in Update 1. The first update dropped in late March, and added a couple of new gameplay modes to spice up the post-game. There are now 2 dedicated challenge modes, one for Cyberspace and one for Combat. The Cyberspace one is pretty basic. You just play through each of the island Cyberspace stages one by one, and you're ranked depending on your final time. It's pretty much just arcade mode, but you play the stages back to back. The time limit for the S ranks is super generous. I got it on my first try with a good chunk of time left to spare, which was kind of a letdown if I'm going to be honest. I think it would have been cool if there was an option to make the S rank time super strict or something, but as it stands, it doesn't really do anything to make itself stand apart from what we already had. The Combat Challenge mode is a bit more interesting. It's also split up by island, but it feels a lot more engaging since the type of enemies you're fighting are different between each area. Having the ability to refight the bosses was one of the most requested features for these post-launch updates. So while I would have preferred just to be able to select the bosses outright, this is still a really cool addition. Although having said that, I find the way it was implemented to be very lackluster. When you start the combat mode, you're prompted to pick a save file to import your stats from. In my opinion, this decision ruins the balance of this mode, because you can go in with max stats and steamroll the entire thing fairly easily. If anything, you're incentivized to do so, considering the ranking is based only on how fast you can finish each wave. Having the ranking be based on time just kinda highlights how inconsistent the combat can be. There's a lot of Guardians that require you to wait for long periods of time in order to open them up for attack. Granted, there's a lot of tricks you can do to mitigate that waiting time, like running up to the Tower Guardian and intentionally taking a hit to use the recovery smash and kill them quickly, or using the parry to stall yourself in the air and keep yourself from having to reclimb Ashura, but it just feels like a weird choice to me. I think it would have been better if instead of having it be time-based, you could have a point-based ranking system instead. Maybe have a few different difficulties that adjust both the point requirements for the S ranks and how strong you are. And maybe you could have different modifiers that could increase the amount of points you get. Stuff like faster or stronger enemies, limiting the amount of skills you have, or maybe even limiting the time frame of the parry. But as it stands, you're incentivized to go in with the max file to get the best results. It's left up to the player to balance the mode to their liking, and even then it's much more of a hassle to do so than it's probably worth, since it's based on save files and not in the options of the mode itself. That's a common theme with both of these challenge modes. They aren't really a challenge unless you handicap yourself in some way. They both have a lot of potential for really interesting and engaging challenges, but as they stand, they're pretty lackluster in my opinion. Pretty disappointing overall. Outside of those 2 game modes, there were a couple of additions to the main game as well. They added a jukebox, and spread across the islands are different music tracks from across the series. They're not super well hidden or anything, but it's nice to be able to spice up the music while you're exploring the islands for the 1000th time. There's even a few on the 4th island that originally only had the pillars, which gives you an actual reason to explore that island after you clear it. There's so many cool structures and areas on this island that are out of the way of the towers. It's criminal that there was no reason to explore this place in the base game. It's not that the music in Frontiers is bad or anything, but it's nice to be able to change the music for variety's sake. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy jamming out to Let the Speed Mended in Ares Island, and 06 music has no right fitting as well in this game as it does. Sonic is known for its music, so this was really a no-brainer inclusion. I just kinda wish there was more music to choose from. 50 songs is a good selection, But for how well this series is known for its music, I feel like this is only really scratching the surface. Regardless, I really dig this edition, and I hope it becomes a mainstay going forward. There's also a photo mode, which is pretty cool I guess, but I found it to be pretty lacking compared to some other photo modes I've tried. The camera is pretty limited and tends to get stuck on things, and the amount of visual adjustments you can make is kinda lacking all things considered. I've never really used these to begin with, but I love seeing the kind of stuff people can come up with using it, so I'm really glad it's here. The best quality of life change by far was adding the ability to cash in all your Coco upgrades at once, which means no more spending 20 minutes upgrading one stat, thank God. They also added the ability to turn off the Starfall minigame, which is kinda weird in my opinion. Like, don't get me wrong, it was a little intrusive and made it really easy to get an abundance of fishing tokens, but I don't think it was enough of a hindrance to remove it altogether, especially after finding out you can manually stop the roulette wheel. Granted, you still have the option to just keep it on, but I don't know, it just seems like a really strange addition to me. The most interesting thing this update adds is the rewards you get for S-ranking the Cyberspace and Combat Challenge modes. For the Cyberspace challenge, you get the ability to use the power boost in Cyberspace, which, I'll be honest, I barely noticed a difference with. And by completing the Combat challenge, you get a new difficulty option with Extreme mode. Extreme mode is both fascinating and really underwhelming. I mentioned potentially adding a harder difficulty in my original video, but this isn't really what I meant. The main gimmick of this mode is that you go through the whole game without upgrading your stats. Oh, and you also die in one hit. Sometimes anyway. The combat in Frontiers is already one of its weaker points, so having a difficulty that focuses on that aspect more than anything only highlights how jank it can be at times. To me, the changes in this mode completely undermine the main gameplay loop, which I don't think should be an issue with the higher difficulty setting. Since you don't have to go out of your way to raise your stats, there's less of a reason to engage with the island challenges, outside of filling out the map and spawning fast travel rails I guess. Since you die in one hit, rings have even less of a purpose than they did in the original game. You keep them when you die, so once you max out you'll stay in the power boost state until you get to a supersonic boss or something. One thing I do like is the changes to Big's fishing minigame. Not only is the cost of fishing been increased, but all of the items in the shop have been inflated as well. While there isn't really a reason to abuse the shop without combat upgrades anyway, it's nice to know that you can't easily cheese the mode through fishing to basically skip everything. On the whole, it's really no different than doing just a low stat run, which I think is a missed opportunity for an extreme difficulty. Instead of adjusting every aspect of the gameplay loop to make it harder, they focus on just the combat portion, and really it just makes it slightly more frustrating than anything. Dying in one hit doesn't really change a lot about the combat, especially considering it's pretty easy to save yourself with a well-timed boost or parry. If anything, it just highlights how frustrating some of the later enemies are designed. That applies to the Titan fights as well. They were clearly designed around an invincible supersonic, so dying when anything so much as grazes you is more frustrating than anything. Dying in one hit is kind of a BS condition to begin with, so I think it would have been cooler if instead they had adjusted other aspects of the open world, like adjusting how many gears you need to enter cyberspace, or how many keys you need to unlock an emerald vault. I think changes like this would have gone a long way to making the mode feel more unique, especially with the existing changes to cyberspace. S-rank times in extreme mode have been adjusted to be a lot stricter, outside of 1-2 ironically enough. I actually really adore this change. They aren't super ball-bustingly difficult or anything, but they're enough where you have to play the stage a few times to get the best ranking, which is much more than I can say for the S-ranks in the base game. It goes a long way to making cyberspace much more engaging when you actually have to try to get the best time. It gives more value to the objectives in each stage, so getting the extra keys by completing all of them feels much more earned. I think it's this small but impactful change to cyberspace that makes the rest of extreme mode feel much more lacking as a result. I can imagine a mode that increases the amount of collectibles you need to progress. Maybe not increasing the amount of memory tokens, because that can already get a little ridiculous, but at the very least increasing the amount of gears and keys that you need. As it is now, it's really easy to get a surplus of both and have nothing to do with them. With the increased cyberspace difficulty, it would force you to engage with the Guardians more to get the amount of keys you need to progress, which I think would improve the gameplay loop as a whole. I would probably also drop the one-hit kill thing, because I think it's more of a crutch than anything, not just in this game, but in games in general, and I think I would keep the base stats thing and make enemies hit harder to compensate. These changes would go a long way to making extreme mode more, well, extreme, but as it stands it really only highlights the worst aspects of the gameplay loop. I only played the first 2 islands in extreme mode, but I think that was more than enough to get a feel for it. It felt almost identical to the low stat run I did for my original video, just a tad more frustrating with the one-hit kill thing, so I didn't really feel the need to replay the whole game. It's nice to have for those who want more of a challenge, I guess, if you can even call it that. but to me it feels like a missed opportunity to make something more unique. That's about it for Update 1. While it makes a lot of pretty neat quality of life changes, I find other additions to be pretty lacking compared to what they could be. The challenge modes both feel half-baked in their execution, and Extreme Mode makes some interesting changes in Cyberspace, but falters in the open zone. That said, Update 2 would come around just a few months later and add a bunch of stuff that legitimately changed the game as we knew it. At first glance, Update 2 seems smaller in scale compared to what was added in Update 1, but in my opinion it has the biggest effect on gameplay. The update was in celebration of Sonic's birthday. They added a bunch of birthday decorations to the island, as well as cute little birthday costumes for all the characters. A new Game Plus option was also added, which is pretty neat I guess. It lets you carry over all your stats so you can blitz through the main game. Unlike some other New Game Plus modes I've seen, it doesn't really do anything else. But it's cool to have anyway for those repeat playthroughs. On the map screen, you can now see totals for all the islands. They even added a counter for all the memory tokens too. I was under the impression they respawned in the Starfall events, so fuck that. But doing so gets you a cute little crown, so that's nice for people who hate themselves enough to do it. The biggest change by far was the ability to adjust the amount of deceleration Sonic has while jumping and on the ground. That's right, Bro actually added physics to the game. This, along with the option to maintain your boost during a jump, improves the game feel significantly. Being able to actually jump off platforms and keep your momentum completely changes how you can approach exploration. It gives the movement this greater sense of flow, and makes it a lot easier to accurately judge your jumps while platforming. This newfound freedom emphasizes one of my favorite aspects of the open zone, that being able to seamlessly chain together different platforming challenges. This update makes it a lot easier to cheese those platforming sections if you know how and where to use it, which gives the player more choice in how you tackle each island. I think being able to jump across these vast landscapes at the speed of sound embodies Sonic's character a lot more than sinking like a rock the moment you get any airtime. Although that still happens every now and then. New Coco challenges were added to each island, which house these new bigger Coco. Each one even has a cute little costume, like a King's Crown or even, hey, he stole Caliburn, what the fuck, put him back! These challenges are a lot more interesting than anything found in the base game. While they still aren't the most difficult thing in the world, they require you to use most of the game mechanics to their fullest, though they can sometimes highlight flaws in the systems. The ones where you have to use the wall climbing ability can be a little jank, but most of them are pretty fun. I think my favorite one is this giant tower thing that acts as a puzzle. You have to hit these switches and pick up all the rings that spawn to open up the way to the next section. There's even these little platforms that can help you launch yourself higher into the tower if you fall, which is much more engaging than your standard Frontiers platforming course. Almost all of the challenges are like this. They aren't nearly as automated as the ones in the base game, so they feel much better to play. The Coco you get from these challenges will extend your boost meter, which I can't help but feels a little undermined by the ability to draw a penis and get an infinite boost, but at least they have a unique reward. New to each of the open zones are these little action chain challenges, which are just kinda okay. They task you with stringing together a bunch of actions together to rack up a score multiplier to get a certain number of points within the time limit. They spawn these glowing orbs all over the place which raise your score multiplier, but you also get points for doing pretty much anything in the open zone, such as rail grinding, fighting enemies, or even jumping off springs. These are pretty easy to S-rank, and there's just a little too many of them for my liking. There's about 10 of them per island, and they don't do a whole lot to stand apart from one another, so if you've played one, you've pretty much played them all, which can make them all drag after a while. It doesn't help that a lot of them are really close together, so you'll end up going to the same spots for multiple challenges since they give you consistent points. The reward you get from getting all the S ranks is insanely worth it though. For doing all of them and getting an S rank, you unlock the Spin Dash, which is arguably the most broken the Spin Dash has been in the entire series, only really rivaled by the SA1 Spin Dash. You get so much speed from this thing, it's insane. It's basically just a better boost. It's faster, gives you a ton of air, and even damages enemies. With it, you can completely break Cyberspace stages, which makes them just slightly more fun. Coupled with the new momentum stuff, it's pretty easy to break this game in half, which is stupid fun. Seriously, the amount of airtime you can get with the Spin Dash in particular is insane. A far cry from what was possible in the original game. You could argue that it breaks the game a little too much, but I disagree with that sentiment. One, because SA1 Spin Dash had a similar effect on its levels and they're still fun to blast through. and 2, you have to beat the game at least once to unlock the spin dash to begin with. So unless you're using mods or something, you're guaranteed to play through the game as the developers intended at least once before you can get it. I think it's a cool way to encourage and spice up repeat playthroughs, as the way you play the game with the spin dash can be almost completely different than playing it normally. It also gives just a little bit more value to the New Game Plus mode, since it will also carry over the spin dash. While it probably could be fine-tuned a little bit for the next game to be not quite so broken, as it is now, it offers a really unique way to experience the game again, one that's almost completely different from the base game. While Update 2 might seem lacking compared to Update 1 in terms of raw content, in practice it has the biggest effect on the gameplay. I can't stress enough just how much these seemingly small changes improve the feel of the game as a whole. It just feels better to run around in the open zone, which is really important for a game like Sonic. It opens up a lot more room for player expression, which I think was lacking with the more rigid and limited feel of the original game. A lot of the jank from the base game has been ironed out, and a lot more freedom has been put into the hands of the player, something I feel is essential for an open world game like this. The last DLC is set to be an expansion to the game's story, and even adds 3 new playable characters. If these first 2 updates can have this much of an effect on the game as a whole, I can only imagine what this last update will bring to the table. Going into Update 3, I honestly wasn't very sure what to expect. Sega has been notoriously all over the place with their DLC practices. Remember, this was the same company that tried to charge money for Supersonic and Forces, and the same company that had paid DLC for a Genesis game compilation. Twice. Considering that this was going to be free DLC, going in I was keeping my expectations in check. At most, I expected a little more to be added to Uranus Island, and have the other characters be playable in cyberspace or something. But I'm happy to say, I couldn't have been more wrong. The amount of content in this update completely blew me away. What I was expecting to be a little 2 to 3 hour experience easily took me over 10 to 15 hours to fully complete. It's clear that the development team was listening to feedback from the main game, because most if not all of it was addressed in this DLC, to varying amounts of success. The DLC acts as an alternate take on Uranus Island. Sage tells Sonic that she can bring Sonic's friends back from cyberspace to help him look for the emeralds. And while they're doing that, Sonic can talk to the Ancients to hone his cyber corruption into a new power. The plot doesn't really amount to much outside of that setup, but we do get a lot of neat character moments in lieu of a more interesting story. Through these, they took the opportunity to clarify some of the weirder aspects of the base game, like why a pinball table exists on Chaos Island, and others are just characters shooting the shit together. I think my favorite running theme with these interactions is making Sonic look like a crazy lunatic. It's revealed that the rails and platforms Sonic has been jumping on the whole game aren't actually real, and Sonic only sees them because he's so in tune with cyberspace. Don't ask me how that works, because I couldn't tell you, but it's pretty funny to think about Sage watching Sonic continually launch himself off of nothing the whole game, so I'll allow it. Another scene reveals Big wasn't actually in the fishing portals. Sonic just made him up while he was in that section of cyberspace. While I like the idea that the real Big just happened to wander into cyberspace completely oblivious, this is equally as funny, since it implies Sonic is just out of his mind. I guess that's just what over a decade of mid-games will do to a motherfucker. Other conversations are more tame, like one where Sage asks Tails to team up with Eggman, or Eggman plotting to steal the Master Emerald right in front of Knuckles. While most of these are great, a few just kind of exist. Like there's a lot of them that are literally just 2 lines and that's it. They're just like, "We gotta get the emeralds!" Aight. And that's it. I noticed a couple of these scenes were also missing voice lines. It didn't happen super often, but it did happen enough for me to notice it. There's a lot of these conversations dotted around the island, but thankfully they don't require any collectibles to activate, so you can watch them whenever you happen to find one while exploring. Speaking of, Uranus Island has been massively overhauled, and it's all for the better in my opinion. The first change you'll probably notice is the revamped island challenges. These have been overhauled to be actually engaging. It's crazy what adding player agency can do to make your challenge more fun. They fixed about every issue I had with them in the base game. A lot of them took me a few tries to get down, which is a good thing. Some challenges even build on themselves now, like this one that makes you go through a couple of sets of rings instead of just one, or this one that makes you run across the entire island to 3 different checkpoints, and then back to the starting point. I can't tell you how happy I was when I hit this one-time trial and saw that I only had like 3 seconds to complete it. and only manage to do so with a fraction of a second left. They even changed the timing on the parry so you can't cheese the jump rope puzzles anymore. While not every one of these challenges is a winner, almost all of them have been improved for the better, while still being fair and simple enough to not eat up a lot of your time. The only one I can think of that wasn't much better was this one where you have to hit the ball through the hoops. Not because it's particularly difficult, but because the trajectory and distance the ball travels feels pretty inconsistent. But overall, these are all winners, and a major step up from the challenges in the base game. The same can even be said about the generic platforming challenges you find all over the island. These are way more involved than the simple platforming chains we had before. Some of them are even full-on puzzles. Instead of memory tokens, the reward for these challenges alternate between EXP for the new characters, Cocos that fill out the maps, or even just the stat-raising items. I think what's so impressive about these challenges is that they fully take advantage of the unique movesets with each of these new characters. For the first time since I think 06, we're able to play as characters other than Sonic in a 3D game, and in my opinion they all turned out fantastic. You start out the DLC as Amy, who is pretty much Sonic but with a triple jump. She uses her tarot cards for the first time since CD, which is a really nice callback. She can use them to either attack enemies or even glide for a short time, which makes her really versatile for platforming. She's probably my favorite to play as out of all of the new characters. Having said that, Knuckles is also pretty fun to play in my opinion. Knuckles was always one of my favorites to play as in the adventure games, so I'm happy to see him so fun to play again here. He has his trusty glide at his disposal, and it can become extremely fast through an upgrade on the skill tree. He's so cool he can even glide up mountains. He's also able to climb walls. The only downside though is that unlike other games in the series, Knuckles can't climb just any wall. He's only able to climb these context-sensitive walls, which is kinda disappointing considering this game's focus on freedom and exploration. But there's plenty of places you can get high up and glide around from, so it's not a huge loss. It also helps that the challenges that require you to climb around are really fun for the most part, so it doesn't feel like a wasted skill. My only gripe with them is that sometimes when you take damage while climbing, you're knocked off the wall and aren't allowed to jump, which can be pretty frustrating in some of the more laser-happy mazes. Tails is the last new playable character, and he's kind of an oddball. Unlike the rest of the cast, he doesn't have a homing attack, which can make exploring a bit finicky at times, but he's able to make up for that with his ability to fly. His flight is supposed to be limited, but there's a few ways to extend that flight time beyond what was intended. One way is by purchasing the wrench upgrade, which when thrown acts as a platform that Tails can jump off of, which resets his jump and flight time. The other way is by getting the Cyclone upgrade and getting max rings, which allows you to summon it and fly around really fast. This is supposed to be limited to the boost gauge, but you can do the infinite boost trick with the Psyloop to get permanent flight time. Other than that though, Tails is pretty lacking compared to the other characters, although I can't deny how happy I was to see the Cyclone again. It even has a giant laser, which is so sick. While I enjoy playing as each of these characters a lot, they aren't without their quirks. For example, each of them have a set of animations that halt their movement for a short time, which can be a little jarring when you're just trying to run around the map. Knuckles is probably the least guilty of this, as his affects the start of his glide and is less intrusive to me. But for Tails and Amy, they both affect their boost. I mentioned before that Tails gets the Cyclone mech, but Amy gets this sick cartwheel thing, and it's super fast and fun to drive around in. But for how cool these upgrades are, they create a starting lag for the boost, which can really interrupt the flow of exploration. In my opinion, these characters feel a little unbalanced. I mentioned in my original video how one of my favorite aspects of Frontiers was figuring out how to skip platforming challenges and chain together different memory tokens. That's also present in the DLC, but here it doesn't feel as fulfilling. Once you start upgrading these characters, it becomes extremely easy to skip pretty much every platforming challenge the DLC has to offer. I think the difference is that with Sonic, it felt like a game within a game trying to figure out how to choose the different platforming sections. Sonic's moveset is comparatively limited, so you had to figure out how to launch yourself in the right area to get the desired result. But with these other characters, a lot of the time it's just as easy as falling to the right area, or in Tails' case just holding A, which feels lame in comparison. Being able to skip the platforming sections if you were skilled enough in the base game didn't feel as bad, because the platforming sections themselves were really simple and barely worth going through more than once. But in this DLC, the platforming sections are actually really good, so it feels like a waste to end up skipping them. It's conflicting, because I like the freedom to be able to play the game how you want, something I feel the base game was a little lacking in, but I also think just skipping these sections feels off considering how well they're designed. I don't know how to put it into words exactly, but it feels just a little too easy to skip these sections, which ends up making it feel less fulfilling. Granted, you could just choose not to skip them and go through the platforming stuff anyway, but I think just having the option to skip them so readily available devalues these amazing platforming sections by default. Anyway, outside of that mess, I think the characters are also pretty lacking when it comes to combat. I'm not really sure if this is the fault of the characters themselves, or if it's the way that the Guardians were overhauled. I guess they heard my complaints about the Guardians being a little lacking in the base game, because these new Guardians feel like they're on crack. Some are pretty much the same, like Ninja and Tower, but some like Spider were completely changed. You have to side-loop his bombs to knock them back and open him up for damage, which sounds really cool on paper, but I found it to be pretty finicky. I would go to side-loop a bomb only for it to disappear right when I closed the loop, and sometimes when I did get it right, the bomb would just whiff the boss. If I wanted to feel bad about my aim, I'd just play a first-person shooter. I'm not sure if it's because I played on hard mode or not, but these guys have so much fucking health and defense. These guys are also extremely fast now and like to spam projectiles. If the parry wasn't how it is in this game, I would think this is extreme overkill. It feels almost impossible to dodge all of these projectiles, they're all over the place. For as much as I complained about extreme mode earlier, I'm genuinely not sure if I could beat these guys with it on. That sounds like a nightmare. Compare this lack of damage with the extreme speed, it feels really difficult to do anything to these guys as any character other than Sonic. These characters don't really have any other attacks outside of their basic ones. They each get one attack through the skill tree, but it doesn't do nearly enough to compensate for the lack of damage. Each character can get a debuff effect added to their parry, which is a really cool idea, but because I rarely fought enemies with them, I didn't get to use it all that much. Because of this, I pretty much only fought these new Guardians with Sonic. Because he has a larger moveset, he's able to deal more consistent damage. But after a while, I stopped fighting these guys altogether. I found fighting them was more frustrating than it was worth, and the only thing you get from fighting them is portal gears, which you can find all over the island anyway. However, you'll definitely want to go out of your way for portal gears this time, as Cyberspace has been massively overhauled, and, dare I say it, fun. I don't think anything could have prepared me for how blown away I was for Cyberspace in this DLC. There's quite a lot of them this time, at least compared to other islands, and when making these they decided to do the unthinkable, create unique level design. No level in this DLC is ripped from an older Sonic game. These stages are built on top of pre-existing Frontier stages, but the level design is so different that you can't really tell. In a way, they remind me of the DLC stages from Unleashed, which took pre-existing levels and spammed a bunch of pre-made assets onto them to change them up. Though in my opinion the results here are much better than they are in Unleashed. Not only are these stages fun to play through, but the S-rank times are actually kind of challenging. A lot of these stages are built with stuff like the spin dash in mind, so there's a lot of opportunities to launch yourself off of ramps, or use a well-placed rail launch to skip certain sections. These levels are filled to the brim with stuff. There's so many alternate paths to the goal, which was so refreshing to see. Some levels even have a hidden goal ring to take advantage of these new paths. The objectives in the stage were also changed a bit. Now instead of red rings, you need to collect 2 new collectibles. Well, I say new, they were actually in Forces, but they're new to this game. One collectible are these numbered rings that you have to collect in order from 1 to 5, and the others are these silver moon rings that disappear after a short time, requiring you to collect them in quick succession. The silver rings are often placed in tight platforming sections that are made even more tense with a limited time frame. And both sets offer a reason to thoroughly explore each stage instead of just gunning it for the S rank. I think my favorite example of the numbered ring placement is in stage 4H, which has them spread across the whole level instead of having them all bunched together, which forces you to weave in between pathways to get them all. There's one more collectible added in this update, which I'm not really a fan of. Some stages now house these hidden animals, which when found need to be picked up and carried to a designated location. On paper, I don't mind the challenge itself. I actually really like the idea of doing a platforming challenge with a limited moveset. It reminds me a lot of the bonus stages from Mario Sunshine. But I don't think this challenge belongs in Cyberspace. These stages are normally about getting to the end as fast as possible, but these animals require you to comb the stage for them, stop in your tracks, and then do the platforming section before moving on. It just takes up too much time. I like the idea of the challenge on paper, but I think it would fit better in the open zone rather than in Cyberspace. While I enjoy this new take on Cyberspace a lot, it's still got a lot of that Frontiers jank holding it back. Turning is still incredibly tight, which can make some sections feel really stiff, or sometimes not even work at all. Sonic's turning while jumping also tends to get in the way a lot more than it should, and the obnoxious rebound on the homing attack tends to hurt the flow of the gameplay. Although interestingly, some of the stages are built with that delay in mind, which is actually kinda neat. At the end of the day though, I'm really impressed with what they were able to do with Cyberspace. I commend Sonic Team for taking something I really didn't care for in the base game and turning it into something special. The main reason to go to Cyberspace in this update is to get these special Coco that unlock towers scattered across the island. Or you can just find a million of them on the island because Sonic Team hates committing to an idea. These towers are very reminiscent of the towers from Rhea Island, only much harder. The platforming on these can be very difficult. There's no checkpoints on them, so if you fall, you have to restart them. Some of them have objects that don't respawn if you fall, which is pretty frustrating too, forcing you to reload a save or die to reset the area. Sonic's control in the air is remarkably tight in this game, and I think these towers take really good advantage of that. But I really like these tower climbs, and I think they house some of the best platforming sections Frontiers has to offer. These towers house trials that Sonic needs to overcome in order to hone his cyberspace corruption. At the top of these towers lie the souls of the ancients that were piloting the titans we fought in the base game, and they each have a trial for Sonic to overcome. Most of them are pretty simple, just fighting a group of enemies with low stats or a set moveset. The only one that's really difficult is the one where you had to fight the shell enemies. On hard, these enemies are stupid fast, and it's hard to deal any damage to them before their shell falls back down, and the time limit is extremely strict, but I eventually got it after a few tries. While these trials don't really have anything to write home about, the last trial with the Master Coco is an entirely different beast, and it's divided the fanbase more than the release of Sonic Colors. This trial is by far the hardest thing in the game, and might just be the hardest thing in any Sonic game period. It's basically a boss rush, but your stats are set to level 1 and there are no ring refills. The parry has also been upgraded to the perfect parry, which has a smaller activation window. At first I was really happy about this change. The busted parry was one of my biggest complaints with the base game, but I think this was a really bad place to implement it for the first time. The bosses in this game were designed with the regular parry in mind, and as such a lot of the hitboxes for the attacks don't quite match up with their animations. Now that the parry window is so strict, it becomes a lot harder to judge when you should actually parry attacks. On paper this isn't really a bad thing, and even in practice both Giganto and Knight are pretty easy even if you do miss a few parries. But nothing can prepare you for how brutal Wyvern can be in this challenge. To progress in the Wyvern fight you have to consistently parry attacks. In this fight in particular it's pretty easy to miss parries because there's so much going on screen. Normally you would have the Sixth Sense feature that warns you of upcoming attacks, but later in the fight its attacks just don't have it for some reason, so it can be hard to tell when you need to parry. The fight is divided into two different phases, the chase phase and the attack phase. You can shorten the chase phase by parrying the missiles, but if you're hit during the attack phase you're set all the way back to the beginning of the chase phase. Since the parry is a little inconsistent, this fight quickly becomes very frustrating as you see your rings dwindle lower and lower each time you mess up. It doesn't help that every time you end up dying you have to restart from the beginning, going through Giganto and the tower climb to even get another shot at Wyvern. You can switch the difficulty to make the parry window longer, but that only does so much to mitigate the issue. After a while though, you can get a handle on the timing, and I can't deny how good it felt to finally finish the trial after hours of getting my ass kicked. After that insane difficulty spike, the only thing left to do is take down the final Titan. The initial Supreme boss fight is identical to the one in the base game. The fight was and still is extremely jank. Things just don't work in this fight for some reason. Near the end of the fight you have to trigger a QTE before you can finish him off, but for whatever reason it would just never trigger no matter what I did. I eventually figured out you can trigger the QTE by breaking one of the shooter things orbiting around him, causing him to swipe at you. But I had no idea if this is actually what you're supposed to do. The game isn't very clear about that. That's actually a running theme as we move into the next boss. The end takes over Supreme using this cord thing, which makes Supreme's health regenerate really quickly. Sonic uses his newfound cyber power to ascend to Supersonic 2. This boss is actually pretty rad. In this ascended state, the parry is upgraded to the perfect parry, and all of the projectiles that the boss shoots decreases your maximum amount of rings, which I think is a really cool way to challenge those who have gone in with a maxed out Sonic. It would be better if the Minecraft trees weren't getting in the way the entire time, but I digress. It feels really good to knock back all of the end's flashing attacks and then close in with your own flashy attacks and deal stupid damage. That is, until you realize that the boss is continually regenerating its health. And no matter what you do, you can't seem to figure out how to stop it. You try everything, spamming different attacks doesn't work, and side-looping it, while looking sick, doesn't really do anything either. Eventually you die and have to redo the entire Supreme fight again to get a crack at it, only to have the same exact thing happen to you a second time. It turns out the thing you're supposed to do is attack the cord coming out of the boss's neck. While that probably seems like a no-brainer, there's no other fight in the game where you have to change targets. Hell, there's not even a dedicated button on the controller to change targets. Instead, what you have to do is attack the head once, dodge, and just hope that the lock-on changes to the cord for you to attack it. This is incredibly frustrating, and made me really mad when I eventually had to look it up after dying to the boss 3 or 4 times. After you manage to find that though, the boss is pretty simple. You end up stealing Supreme's gun, which Eggman uses as a weapon. After defeating it, Sonic loads into the barrel of the gun Sonic X style, and then Sonic powers up again to this sick-looking cyber form. Eggman shoots Sonic through the end and destroys it, freeing Sonic's friends from cyberspace, and once again ending Sonic Frontiers. Sage even gets to live this time, which is really adorable. The Final Horizon DLC is almost exactly what I was looking for going into the next game. Excluding the Master Coco trial and the frustrating vagueness of the final boss, I feel that the difficulty is extremely fair and rewarding. Hell, even the Master Coco trial was exhilarating for me. It helped me appreciate some of the lesser details of the Titan bosses, like how side-looping a boss allows you to deal more damage while it's chained up. There were even some new attacks that I got to see that I didn't even know these bosses had. I never would have figured out that kind of stuff if it wasn't for this insane difficulty. While I appreciate the difficulty spikes this DLC provides, I can also definitely understand why it would be a turnoff to a lot of people. It's far and beyond what the main game expects of you in terms of difficulty, so I can understand why so many people would go into this not expecting it and being put off by it. But to me, one of the big things the main game was lacking was an engaging and decent challenge, so getting exactly that with this DLC made me really happy. For free DLC, this is extremely impressive. I got far more playtime out of it than I had expected going in, and I enjoyed pretty much my entire time with it. While it's kind of disappointing that there's no post-game unlocks, like being able to play as the new characters in the base game, or a playable Super Sonic outside of bosses, the update has more than enough quality content that I can't really complain. Having said that though, the DLC isn't perfect. I ran into my fair share of jank and glitches during the course of my playthrough. Just because your characters are holograms doesn't mean they need to clip through walls, guys. Knuckles once again has an infinite jump glitch, because I guess it's a tradition at this point, and I got stuck on more things than I would like to admit. I had a lot more trouble with the draw distance this time around too, because a lot of the platforming challenges are more intricate and higher in the air. It can sometimes be hard to tell where you're supposed to enter them. It also made finding one of the hidden cyberspace goals far harder than it needed to be. Seriously, I don't know how you're supposed to find this goal without getting extremely lucky. I can also definitely see why some people were put off by the harsh difficulty jump. Overall though, I feel like it's a step in the right direction, since a lot of the main game was brain dead easy. So if they were able to fine-tune and nail a difficulty somewhere in the middle of the two extremes, I think it would make the game a lot more engaging, and less frustrating than this can be at times. This game has changed a lot over the past year, and in all honesty, all these updates have changed my opinion on the game for the better. While the base game is still on the simple side of things, the changes to the movement really do completely change how you can approach the open zone, and allow for more player expression while exploring. It's clear that Sonic Team is listening to feedback and implementing it where they can, and I have to commend them for that. I can't think of many games off the top of my head that took player feedback and implemented it so quickly. I think I was just a little too harsh on Frontiers during my initial video. I don't regret the things I said at the time, but now that more time has passed, I think I can appreciate Frontiers more for what it is rather than what it isn't. The only thing I'm still pretty hard on is the game's presentation, especially in the cutscenes. It's not like it looks downright bad or anything, but it could be so much better. I dream for a day that we get in-game cutscenes on par or at least close to the opening cutscene of Unleashed. Not even from a pure visual perspective. Just making the characters more expressive would go a long way to making the cutscenes more fun. Which, in all fairness, Frontiers is taking small steps towards. It shouldn't be very hard to improve in this department either. Simple things like removing the frame rate cap and the weird aspect ratio during cutscenes, and especially during in-game scenes, really goes a long way to making them feel more premium, I guess. But other than that small, admittedly personal nitpick, what Sonic Team has set up with Frontiers is frankly really impressive. Sonic has been a mainstay in my life for about as long as I can remember. One of the first video games I ever played was Sonic Unleashed, a game I would argue has the highest production value of any Sonic game, and was arguably also the last time Sega put everything they had into a Sonic game. It was the game that sold me on Sonic as a character, and set the standard in my eyes for what every game should be going forward. So it's been frustrating to see the franchise make the same mistakes over and over again, year after year since then. Yeah, I could go back and play the older games again, and I do enjoy them for what they are, but there's just something so exciting and fresh about a new release. For a while there, it felt like Sega didn't care about their own flagship franchise, which was frustrating to see from a franchise that used to stand up to other platforming giants like Mario. It seemed like the fans were doing most of the heavy lifting when it came to quality Sonic content, which while impressive in its own right, was also a little tragic in its own weird way. But for the first time in a long time, Frontiers seems to be at least attempting to break that cycle. Playing through this DLC gave me some of the same feelings I had while playing Unleashed all the way back in 2008. It reminded me of the joy of mastering a stage over the course of countless retries and finally getting that perfect run, or bashing my head against a wall fighting a hard boss that was giving me trouble, only to eventually memorize its patterns and finally take it down. Frontiers was never going to be the game to beat all Sonic games, but as a transitionary title, I think it does what it needs to do in setting the foundation for the future. I think it's easy to forget just how spoiled we are in terms of this kind of game as Sonic fans. Other games that also acted as transitory titles, such as Unleashed and Adventure, are often hailed as the best in the series, and those were also the first attempts at those respective styles. It's really easy to point to Frontiers as lesser, when it doesn't completely stick the landing in as many places as those games did, but I still think it gets more right than it does wrong. Is it anywhere near my favorite Sonic game? No, not really, but I think there's still plenty of value in it. I'd be lying if I said I didn't find myself itching to come back to it more than some other games in this series. Sonic Team has proven to me that given the proper time and budget, they are more than capable and willing to give us a quality product. If Sega is able to get their head out of their ass after the success of Frontiers, I genuinely think we could be in for something special next time around, which is a confidence I haven't had in this franchise for a long, long while, but only time will tell on that front. I guess what I'm trying to say is, because of all this, I'm really excited about the Sonic brand again for the first time in a while. It's because of all this that I think I finally know how to feel about Sonic Frontiers.
Your friends' efforts and restore them. They would then seek out the Chaos Emeralds for us. And then I would guide you on how to convert that corruption into power so that you may end this conflict and save Father.
I don't care how many islands or titans it takes. I'm getting them back this time.
I just tried to save you. I'm not doing it again.
I know it's been rough, and that things are confusing, but I need you guys to just follow my lead.
Hey, thanks for making it to the end of the video. If you liked what you saw, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps me out a lot more than you think it would, so any little bit helps, and I always appreciate your guys' support. If you'd like to directly support the channel, consider becoming a channel member. In return, I can offer early videos, your name in the credits, and even a unique channel badge. If you're interested, the link is in the description. The next video is looking to be on Persona 5 Tactica. It doesn't look like there's a lot of buzz going around this one, and it looks kinda interesting personally speaking, so I want to try and shine a light on it if I can. Whether it's good or bad, it should be fun to talk about at the very least, so we'll see how that goes. Anyway, Consider following me on Twitter if you want any updates on future videos, or whatever other silly things I decide to post. That's about it for this one. Thanks again, have a good one.